My name is Jesse Solomon. I'm the CEO of Emmer & Co. We're a heritage poultry company. And I'm going to let my fellow panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lindenbaum, and I'm a recovering entrepreneur. I actually spent 15 years here in the Valley in the technology industry and then moved into venture capital in 1999. Advanced Ventures is my firm. We're one of the few remaining 99 vintage maiden funds still out there. We've been investing in the AgTech space since 2000, which is pretty early in this new wave of AgTech investing. Our fund invests across the traditional technology spectrums, IoT, and communications. Many of those categories today are very much involved in the animal space. We've moved quite directly into areas like nutrition and protein, and I think I'll be holding down the technology Silicon Valley angle to protein today.
I'm Stephen Hohenrieder. I also spent 15 years investing across a broader range of assets, but sold a business in 2007 and decided to spend all of my time trying to combine what was experience in education and ag with my broader investment and operating experience to essentially deploy capital along the value chain of our food system in ways that were very financially focused, but also enabled much more regenerative practices in the companies that we were investing in, but also for others. Today I'm involved with something called Prather Ranch as a portfolio company. We've spent 3 years reorganizing this 36-year-old vertically integrated beef company, which has one of the largest genetically closed mother herds in the country. They've tracked every animal from birth to the package for 25 years. And because of these practices, we end up selling waste materials like hides and bones and arteries into the biomedical industry. Because of the genetic traceability and also the standard procedures that they use to essentially produce a branded beef product that is sold through the Ferry Building in San Francisco, direct to consumer and to wholesale.
That's great. So, the panel today is called Sustainable Protein, but I thought we could kind of start a discussion. I had emailed them earlier about some of these topics I thought could be, provide for a great conversation. I thought we could start by talking about supply chain. And one of the things that's important, so, I'm a chicken company, so I raise chickens. We really work on supply chain. We have a representative of a beef company here. And one of the important things to remember about the food system is that the big industrialized food industry has spent the last, 60 some odd years creating an entire supply chain that is really, really, really good at getting bad food to the most amount of people at the cheapest price. And so when you have companies that are trying to change that system and rebuild supply chain, we have to figure out how to address that because it's a huge challenge. So that was one of the kind of first topics I thought we could talk about is how do you address the challenge of such an incumbent supply chain?
Sure, I'm happy to respond. So I tend to take a little bit of a different perspective to where our food system's going. There's a lot of focus on making the existing system more efficient, and I think there's a wonderful proxy for where this could all go in the wine industry and the evolution of custom crush. You had a very industrialized industry with very controlled distribution and value chain infrastructure. But for a lot of reasons that we don't have time for here, people started to add value to their products and started to brand them. And other people decided to invest in infrastructure to make wine for others rather than having to buy that infrastructure or buy that capital equipment for their own enterprise. And over the last 40 years, you've had an explosion of wine brands, to the tune of 10,000 from a few hundred. I don't know that we necessarily need to, I don't think that the industrialized food system is going away, and I don't think that we need to try and shift that infrastructure. But I think as people decide to invest in supporting small to mid-sized farmers, which will happen, that you'll have an explosion of branded products that we're just beginning to see today. And I think it's enabled by consumer demand. And we could go into a different tangent, but the consumer demand is there, and we already see a supply and demand imbalance. and we see companies already starting to secure their own supplies through all the way back to land in the value chain in order to meet consumer demand, which they can't do today.
So I'm going to just take a page from Bernie Sanders' book here and just basically say that we're talking animals here. Animals are just not a sustainable protein source at all, conceptually. And if you look at some data out there, the first thing is if you want to look at the most consuming element in the protein supply chain today, it's beef. They consume water. They put out methane gas. If you look at their feed sources for protein output, they're some of the lowest out there. Protein's a little bit better, and then poultry's a little bit better. And then you start moving down the sort of efficiency and sustainability to protein ratios, right? So, at the beef top of the food chain, then, or so to speak, and then moving down into things like algae, and we should be talking about crickets. And now we're talking about some of the most interesting things that we're seeing out there. And to put on our Silicon Valley hat here, and there's some people here from IndieBio, and we have a very interesting company in this category that's actually using natural technology to produce protein. So when you want to talk about the global impact over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and you look at places like China, where you've got an entire change in their structure from an agrarian to what amounts to an information or industrial sort of economy, there is a huge need for sustainable protein. And when you look at that, none of the sources out there, whether it's beef, poultry, fish, even really, frankly, algae or crickets, are truly sustainable forms of protein. And what's interesting is when you look at the data, in fact, follow us on Twitter because we just are tweeting this today, data just came out that the meal replacement market, just meal replacement, is going to be a $12 billion industry by 2020. That's a couple years from now. Meal replacement, those are those funky foods.
Are you talking about Soylent?
Well, what I'm talking about are alternative sources. So that's where you see the cutting edge of sustainable protein. And when you think about that, if you're familiar, there's a company called Cohen, which is with a Q, out of the UK, which was just purchased for $800 million, which actually uses mushroom technology similar to our company, Myco, which uses mycelia, mushrooms, everybody, to essentially consume food waste, organic food waste, and produce the highest grade amino acid rich protein at a cost that would frankly rival any of the most industrialized soy or other types of protein. Yet this is sustainable, yet this is food waste driven, and in turn, from a protein load perspective, is basically the equivalent of rice and legumes or something mixing into a perfect protein base. So when we think about sustainable protein, for us, it's much less of how do we juice, the existing supply chain or try and manage the existing supply chain. I think we view broadly, the animal protein side as a boutique industry going forward. And when I say going forward in 20, 30, 40 years, when we think about, the farming space, that ultimately becomes boutique. But when you're starting to talk about feeding billions of people, you start talking about sustainability, then those conversations need to move beyond farmland and animals, etc.
Well, Stephen, with Prather, are you trying to feed billions of people?
No, and I think you make great points. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive either. I think they're very different products. Sure. So my interest with Prather is to look at beef production, and part of my interest in the beef industry is its current state. But all of the statistics that you quote relate to confined feeding operations, the conventional system. So if you look globally, there is a lot more grassland that's not being used to produce food, that could be producing food, than is not, that is currently already in production. So I'm not an advocate of...
But they still drink, don't they? They're little thirsty beasts, right?
But not to the level that you were describing. And so if you look at these things as systems, and maybe I can back up a little bit. After World War II, we moved to an industrialized system where we stopped thinking about soil health for productivity in our farms. And today, you could essentially take a seed, put it in a sponge, add a little water, add a little fertilizer, some pesticides and herbicides, and out will come a plant. And you'd cut the plant and eat it. But I think there's a shift in thinking that this isn't sustainable in and of itself, no matter what you're producing. So whether it's just part of the solution or the complete solution, I happen to believe that we need to look at how we are producing food on the land and think about ways to build fertility naturally, and also build an economic model that's actually sustainable for farmers. Farmers who have been squeezed over time and are now getting to the point where they're starting to consider other options that they may not have considered 10 years ago. I'm actually a big fan of the alternative protein sources. I just am not necessarily aligned with the idea of trying to use alternative protein sources to replicate meat. I just think you create a different product.
Right, no, and that's a totally different space. Although I will say that Frankenburgers are pretty cool. Has anybody seen any of the Frankenburgers out there? Memphis Meat, Beyond Meat, some of these others. Indie Bio, which is a very interesting, sort of incubator in San Francisco, just had Memphis Meat. Did you take a look at Memphis Meat? So Memphis Meat actually takes a actual muscle and sample from the animal and actually grows the meat in a bioreactor. So that's Franken-meat, everybody, in case you didn't know. And what's interesting is it is effectively cloning. So the meat that comes out actually has the same fiber, muscle mass, etc. of what
Or
went
you
in.
could just eat a normal cow.
Well, you could, except if you were in a place like Asia, where the volume of people is very high, and it's interesting because going to Asia, and spending a lot of time chatting with folks like that, there used to be different tiers of quality of meat, right? Talking from the premium stuff that you'll see here, and then it'd be Australian beef would be kind of a lower grade, and then now it was Thai beef, and now they're down to the point where it's like Chinese beef, and does that bark or does that moo? And you just never know. And so, when we start to think through, as venture folks, we're kind of out into the future, right? And our model is, well, how do you find really high levels of return? So, I am taking a bit of the sort of other side of the coin here to make it
global
fun.
perspective.
Right, correct. But then again, we've got an incredibly cool company that addresses a lot of the high-density farming issues you're mentioning, which are a huge problem. These folks use plant-based natural polyphenols to attack some of the biggest challenges in the actual sort of high-density production model, which is where things like scour, diarrhea, and stuff like that really affects mortality, and more importantly, creates this antibiotic use, which is really just doing nasty things to both us and everybody else around who's eating that stuff. I'm sure you guys don't do antibiotics right there.
It's interesting. We actually do give them some antibiotics, but not prophylactically. So we were organic certified. Actually, Prather was one of the first organic certified beef companies and dropped it. For example, if the cow gets an infection in its eye, under organics, you couldn't treat that infection. But to your point, 85% of all antibiotics produced in America are fed to animals to prevent them from getting sick in confined feeding operations. So it's bad.
Right, which ultimately ends up in the water system, which ultimately ends up in our system. And in China, for example, where the density is actually somewhere between 10 and 100 times, because it's hard to map some of these confined operations, they have zero regulation. So, I mean, they're basically buying up the lowest grade antibiotics. God knows what they're feeding their animals, and they're rolling it out the door. So, I mean, you've got some fixes, and poultry as well has got a few challenges in the industrial side as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what we notice is that there's different, depending on how you're approaching the industrial food system and how you're trying to solve it and what scale you're looking at, you're going to attack it from a different perspective. So, we don't think of, we're barely even thinking outside of California right now. And in our wildest dreams, we'll be looking at America. But that's the market we're going after. And so when we think about the problems within the industrial poultry system, Tyson exists and it's going to keep existing. But in America, we want to provide an alternative option for people who want to still eat meat and want to just return to the way that we used to produce this food in this country. And so, there's sustainable as a term that gets thrown around in lots of different ways. But when we think about sustainable, we think about the animal that you're raising is the right animal whose genetics grow the way an animal's supposed to grow, that you're raising them on the land in a holistic manner so that you can always be thinking about soil improvement and fertility, and that you provide an economic model for the farmers that allow them to thrive, and that you're not forcing them into these somewhat, traditionally medieval, serf, fiefdom kind of contracts.
I think there's also another element here. We're spending a lot of time talking about the problem. If you look at the consumer and how the consumer's demands have evolved over time, I happen to believe that they're looking for more of a connection back to their food than more innovation. And what I mean by that is if you look at the period before World War II or before industrialization, consumers didn't aspire to buy organic food, and they didn't care if it was local, but they generally had a connection to their food. With industrialization, the attributes that they valued in their food, I would argue, really shifted toward convenience, toward packaging, toward branding and marketing that had been delivered to them in ways they had never seen before through mediums they had never seen. And I remember as a kid in the 1970s thinking it was such a treat to have a TV dinner, or people were drinking Tang. And if you look at fast food, you had McDonald's ramping up in the 70s, which has come full circle to today, where you've got Chipotle defining the market with fresh, simple ingredients. And while McDonald's may not be, and I think that all of the stuff you're seeing in the news right now is a blip in time. You see the McDonald's of the world trying to respond to that, to stay relevant by announcing they're going to buy antibiotic-free chicken. You saw an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that both Whole Foods and Starbucks are going to start sourcing chickens that are being grown more slowly, to Jesse's point. Not only because they think it's more sustainable, which I think is wonderful, but is not the driver of consumer demand, but the fact that it tastes better, and people are starting to think about the source of their food. And I happen to believe that consumers are actually looking for less innovation as this plays out, rather than more. And it doesn't mean that they are averse to innovation, but if you think about the baby boomers and the Gen Xers, who were really the last generations to be enamored by innovation in the food system after World War II, you've got a whole generation of millennials now who have lived with this stuff their entire life. And they're looking for authenticity. They're looking for connection. And so once again, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, but I think solving for a more regenerative food system that solves for what the consumer wants is very important in combination with the types of things you're talking about.
So as an investor who focuses on a lot of these innovative companies who are, using technology to create solutions, how are they addressing a consumer who wants authenticity and purity and simplicity with products that they probably wouldn't even understand how they were created in the lab?
These are 100% natural. Actually, they're even more natural than your chickens, because these chickens,
Really?
100%. Now, if you're talking about, franken meat, that's a little bit different. But when you talk about natural protein creation, so mushrooms and mycelia and fungi predated chickens. So they've been around a lot longer than your chickens have, number one. And to a large degree, and again, I'm just taking the very techie angle on this whole thing just to make for a fun panel. But at the end of the day, I think we really look at this, through an investor lens across two kind of ways, right? And this kind of applies to everything from core technology to this food world. You sort of have two, distinct categories. You have Brave New World, and then you have better, faster, cheaper, right? And we're going to invest across both sides of that story. And, as we view it, our job, and remember, we work for people, which are called our LPs, is to return capital to them, right? So we certainly love to add a level of altruism to that. However, I think when we view that, we look at it and we say, okay, there's a certain movement-driven system that's helping the food system today and consumer choicing and demanding and so on. But then there's a lot of broken pieces that can be fixed, and certain elements can be targeted and create really big businesses like the animal health I'm talking about earlier, or protein creation. And what's interesting is, I was just looking at statistics, and don't quote me on this, but there's more protein in a McDonald's bun than there is in the burger that you're eating underneath it. Did you know that? Because,
I don't eat at McDonald's.
But you might know about it. The other part of the equation, which is super interesting, is that actually bakeries consume more protein, are one of the biggest users of protein globally. Now, if you think about it, bakeries, it's because they essentially drive protein into the baking, which is very interesting. And then do you know what the second category of highest protein areas are? Dairy, dealing with protein. So essentially, and that's also pushing it out. But then you look at things like pea protein, that's highly sustainable as well. So, and also natural, organic.
But where do those peas come from?
Well, they're grown.
In what kind of system? Monocropping?
Yeah, I mean, you could do indoor farming, you can do vertical farming. I mean, they're peas. I mean, they won't be upset.
Sure, but
you
I
can
think
choose any path you like.
No, of course. But
Just
I think
dirt's dirt to them.
I think what you end up having is a lot of companies who are trying to create technological solutions to the food system that they see, and they don't go far enough down the supply chain. And
We'll try harder, we promise.
Well, if, for instance, you have a fake meat company that needs to source hundreds of thousands of pounds of a particular crop, there's no sustainable...
Are you talking peas?
Whatever. I don't even, peas, soybean, there's...
Well, that's where when you think of sustainable proteins, you have to kind of up-level that to the more innovative approaches where you're really talking about things like food waste being used to create protein. I mean, that gets super interesting because if you think about it, the American food system throws away a tremendous amount of food waste. So, and again, I don't mean to, hit it in the truly sustainable side, but when you look at that, organic produce that's thrown away at places like Whole Foods, et cetera, is a huge resource that can be leveraged to create protein. So when we view this as sustainability, I think we see that. And what that does is it takes a lot of pressure off the entire food system to allow you to do much more authentic products, to allow for, tiers of consumer acceptance of natural and organic, and also potentially charge more because, you're not being forced to use higher cost ingredients like whey protein and soy proteins and others in the places where they're going to use those, and then it allows for concentration. So I think it's a balancing act between the two.
I wanted to ask about the investment landscape within the context of these companies that we're talking about trying to create sustainable proteins, whether it's alternative, plant-based, or natural, authentic, beef or chicken. It seems like a lot of investors who are now entering this market often forget that it's not a tech startup, that you can't build this company in a couple years and sell it.
Well, I mean, it depends what you're talking about here. I mean, if you're talking about sort of what we would consider kind of boutique animal investing, I mean, that's sort of like it's a winery investment, right? I mean, the economics don't necessarily mirror traditional venture economics, right? But
you're talking about food companies that are supposed to provide protein for billions of people.
Right. Yeah, certainly.
And so the time horizon on those investments is going to be much longer than a traditional...
Well, I mean, I think that's where we're very excited by the space. I mean, we're finding, and if you think about it, these non-traditional proteins already spend a significant amount of time in our reasonable food system. I mean, has anybody here had a protein shake recently? I mean, clearly you haven't. I mean, you have. Okay, good. I mean, some of us, you got to do what you got to do. And, they're using whey protein, they're using soy protein, we're now seeing cricket proteins. And, those are areas that are very important. And as I was talking about bakery, dairy, and a lot of these other categories, utilize a tremendous amount of protein that we're not going to change anytime soon. So, we are seeing, and our missing panelist here was from Impossible Foods, which you folks may have heard about. They're another replacement meat player out there. These are really important things. And if you think about what we as Silicon Valley venture type investors invest in, we're not sort of investing what I can see in the back of the room here. We're trying to invest in what you can see over the mountain over there. So from our perspective, we've got to take big bets because that's why there is things like, high-speed computing. That's why your phone is as big as it is versus a room. So, when we look at that and we say, how can we take pressure off these two supply chains potentially that will allow for the breathing room to actually go out and execute some of the things you're hoping for, that probably comes at our side, which is how do you ratchet up the other side of the food chain?
So you're willing to wait longer?
No, sorry, we won't. Well, our investors aren't willing to wait longer. We're just saying we're probably not going to do chicken investing.
Yeah, sorry, why don't we open it up to questions from the floor? If anyone has questions.
Yeah, the question is, Oceana and the Marine Council have written books about the perfect protein being fish, sustainable fish, or from fish waste. And since the ocean is 80% of the Earth's surface and it's an exponentially natural farm, so to speak, what is your thought about fish protein?
I'm happy to start. I think you raise a great point about fish, and I think F also has emphasized that in every one of our areas of protein, whether it's poultry, whether it's beef, pork, or seafood, we have to solve for a different way of producing it. So when we think about seafood, the issues that they raise right now in these or that they face in these operations right now are feed, because if you look at the feed that's being produced in these farmed operations, it's not sustainable. It's expensive, it's environmentally impactful, and it's not even that great for the fish. There are a lot of people focusing on feed for these purposes. The second is, there is a lot of ocean out there, but there's only so much of that ocean that you could viably raise fish in a production capacity. And so finding ways to do it in places that don't pollute the water is really important. If you look at a lot of the investment right now in this space, and you probably know a lot more about the space than I do, but from what I've learned, there's a lot of emphasis placed on trying to clean the water, because as you've got these fish farms, there's a lot of toxicity from their waste and from the density of fish in these ponds or whatever the open water systems are. So I think that there are a lot of people focused on it, and I think it's wonderful that they are addressing this. But I also think it just fits into a sequence of solutions that people are trying to come up with for every one of our proteins, none of which are going to go away in the consumer market. So I'm a big fan of trying to solve for how we produce each of them. And I think fish is a big opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if anybody's familiar with what industrial, high-density fish farming feed includes today, it's pretty scary. They're feeding fish. Never good to have cannibals in the food system, right? So
Lots of animals are cannibals, but...
Sure, except not those fish. But what is interesting about that is, again, this comes down to the big picture, little picture. One of the biggest challenges that we have in the seafood space today, and really I think those were phenomenal points just in terms of pollution, in terms of available areas. But the biggest problem is there are giant ships roaming the earth right now, to put on my green hat, filled with Chinese sailors vacuuming up the ocean effectively. And that's a bigger problem, in my opinion, than a lot of these other issues. And so some of those solves do require some pretty, moonshot style ideas like the Impossible Foods or the mycotechnologies, because you do have this hungry mass of people coming up the food chain. In fact, what's really interesting is I was looking at some stats, and if anybody finds me after, we tweet this stuff, Advanced Ventures, but also I can send you a report recently from Relux Research, which maps some of these pieces. So fish are right in the middle of sort of the value chain of proteins out there, right? And in their particular little graph, there was beef at the top, both in terms of consumptive elements as well as use of natural resources, and crickets at the bottom. They hadn't gone into truly alternative yet. But what's very interesting about the fish side of it is when you look at the scale of how much is actually produced in a farmed environment versus naturally vacuumed out of the ocean, so to speak, it's very small right now. And when you've got the needs case out there that's pretty big, that's a challenge. So what we're seeing are things like alternative approaches. So there's a company that's doing, basically, for lack of a better word, naturally created shrimp that's actually not shrimp. Much healthier for you and has the same profile. And there's a good group called Fish 2.0 and that is working very hard on sustainability. But our sense is the best way to sustain it is turn it natural. We love those. No, we love them. We just got to keep them from getting vacuumed up by the Chinese.
Patagonia is a great example of a company that they've now created a small food division, Patagonia, the clothing company, and they work with local native fishermen up in Alaska, all sustainable salmon runs. So there are some organizations who are trying to stimulate those types of models.
And it's actually very broad. I missed the point about wild fish. The consumer's driving it. And you're seeing more and more sourcing come from these methods. The problem is that the international market doesn't necessarily agree. And so,
good point.
I think that you're seeing the sourcing practices for the U.S. population change, but I don't know that is going to be the case internationally for some time at least.
Thank you. I think we have another question back there.
Yeah, I want to backpedal just a minute and go back to where your last question was, and that is if you are not willing to wait longer for the return on your investment, how long are you willing to wait? What's the return you expect? And what alternatives are there for those normal growth, traditional ag companies who do take longer and can't match those marks?
Sure. I mean, so just traditionally in the venture world, if you think of just baseline venture economics without doing a little tutorial, if you think about it, 80% of the companies we historically invest in fail. So think about that, right? And actually we have very similar to farmer economics. So 80% of the things we're going to invest in are going to fail. So that means the 20% that remain have to pay for the other 80% and in turn return the amount of capital that our investors, who by the way consider this a very high return asset class, are expecting from us, right? And remember, we have bosses too by default. So, we're really, being driven by this return ratio and a high level return. Now, that being said, many of the things we're doing, similar to traditional technologies, creating the mechanism that allows people to go out and do more traditional investing. The great part is with the efficiency gains that are happening, as I was saying, kind of brave new world versus better, faster, cheaper, through the entire value system, right? So, as I was talking about, they're plant-based natural products that can treat animal health, right? Well, that's something that can help a traditional business move along faster there. Or, for example, there's a friend of mine over here who has a reusability in farm, supply chain products, right? That's another thing that really helps your business become more efficient. And then traditional investment like banks and so on then can come into play, because as you become more efficient, given our investing, whether that's sensors and mobile and health-based products, then in turn, that helps you ratchet up your revenue.
Yeah, I'd add also that at the risk of stating the obvious, it's really important to match the asset to the profile of the capital. And F is investing in very innovative companies that are creating something from scratch in many cases or through R&D. Many of the problems in agriculture require a longer time frame, and there's capital that's happy to invest in that with a much longer perspective. Whether it's 10 years or we're seeing a huge shift to permanent sources of capital, more holding company structures, which tends to be where I end up landing in a lot of the things that I'm doing, where you've got a mechanism for liquidity, but your investors intend to hold it into perpetuity. And so I just think it's so important, depending on what your business is, to match it to the profile of the capital. And oftentimes I observe there being a mismatch of expectations and of and of return, both time and return expectations.
I think we have time for
Yeah.
one or two more questions.
How about a word or two on insects as animal feed to the folks that are in animal agriculture, or a class of investing, and how it's being looked at, and if it's beyond the fence like you were speaking about?
I totally like the
Can I
mole
s-
flavor ones.
Can I start? So we use a lot of feed. Our animals are out on pasture. Our birds are out on pasture all day. They're eating insects, grasses, seeds, everything you can imagine they would eat on the pastures. But they have to be provided with supplemental feed. We would love to use crickets as a source of protein. And I've talked to a lot of the startups here in the Bay Area who are working on cricket companies. And I've told them flat out, like, listen, if you guys could produce X pounds of cricket meal, I will buy them, and if you can, we'll work on the pricing, but as long as you could be like sort of, in the ballpark of what I'm paying. But, a lot of these companies have different goals, and if they're focused on, human bars for human consumption, then they're not really focused on the animal feed side of it. So what we're seeing as a customer is that there's no quantity that's big enough that, we can work with.
And Jesse, would you also say that it's regional, that the cost of transportation prohibits these
Absolutely.
producers from moving it too far?
Absolutely, and absolutely. When it comes to feed, unless you're a giant industrialized player that's moving, trainfuls of different, feedstocks across the country, you have to work with what you have in the region. And so, I think it's important for people who are working on these solutions to think regionally about the whole supply chain.
Well, I mean, we've looked at that space. We think it's really interesting. Again, that comes down to better, faster, cheaper versus Brave New World. We think it's, there is a good opportunity. I think the question there becomes, do you eat them or do you let the animals eat them? And, to the point, it comes down to transportation and density issues. I think the value proposition there ends up being more in the emerging world than it is here, where you're trying to, where high quality animal feed ends up getting shipped from developing nations. And you need to be able to provide in regionally available high quality products. So that's probably an emerging entity more than it is a value in currents.
Sir, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So the question was on the pricing differential between, let's say, an alternative protein source like cricket meal to a traditional protein source like soybean meal. It's not even in the same universe right now. I'd have to look at my figures, but it's actually not so much a quality issue as it is just.
And what's interesting is one of our companies is actually using tomato seeds generated by one of the largest tomato producers here in the state of California as a protein source for animal feed. They're actually leveraging a natural process to debitter those seeds because they actually throw away so many tomato seeds, it's a hazmat problem. So when we think sustainability, those are some things that end up being super interesting on the animal side.
And that is an area that people are generally getting excited about across the board, and that's using food waste, whether you're cooking it or feeding it fresh for livestock. And that's probably our biggest opportunity in alternative feedstocks right now, I would say.
Good point. Really good point.
All right, well, it looks like we're being told to stop. Thank you, fellow panelists, for this conversation, and thank you.
Thank you for the great questions.